Good afternoon. My name is Charles Kelly, and I am interviewing Korean War veteran Paul Eldon Grollmus, whose birthday
is May the 19th.
May 19th, 1932. I'm interviewing him in his apartment in Hamilton, Ohio. Mr. Grollmus was born in Butler County at Fort Hamilton Hospital.
I was a blue baby.
So, Mr. Grollmus, thank you for agreeing for this interview. First of all, tell us a little bit about your early years, maybe about your parents, what your father did, what was life like, where you lived, and all that stuff.
Well, my father and my mother both were raised on a farm. Me and my two brothers, we were raised on a farm in Butler County, a farm that my grandfather owned back in the 40s. So after the 40s, we moved to another little farm north of Collinsville. Then we moved into Collinsville when I was like 15 years old. So during those years, I worked at several different places and block plants and farms and yards and cemeteries. So I eventually graduated from high school and worked at Pease Woodwork at an early age. Then I was going to be recruited in the Army, so I had joined the Naval Reserves in the fall of 1951. So then I got sent papers for my physical examination for the United States Army in Cincinnati. Of course, at that young age, I passed the examination, so I signed up for active duty in the Navy. Went in the Navy on January the 20th in 1952, traveled the world on the U.S.S. Lewis Hancock destroyer, went to the Panama, went to Japan, went to Korea, went to over the international date line and back through the what the other island, or the other Panama?
Suez?
The Suez Canal. Went through the Suez Canal. So I spent some time in Japan and Korea. We went through a typhoon in the fall of '52, going to Japan and coming back from Nice, France. We were running through the ground swells from the Atlantic Ocean in the spring of '53. So we landed back in the United States after the world trip on the destroyer in March of 1953. So I stayed in the service until that fall of '53, and I got my honorable discharge and have been out of active duty since 1953.
Excellent. All right, Mr. Grollmus, tell us a little bit, what was life like on board the ship?
Well, life on board of the ship was sort of like living in a cave, you know. You had very little outside activity, and you could get up on the main deck and that, but I was in sonar, so our sonar deck was on the same deck as the captain deck, which was the highest deck on the ship. So we did have an opportunity to stand on the top deck on the ship, and of course our living quarters were like 3 decks below the main deck, so when we were over the equator, the temperature was like 120 degrees, and our sleeping quarter at midnight was probably 108 degrees without air conditioning and an 8-inch fan for cooling down, which never happened. So it was a long trip on the ship, but
did you ever get seasick?
was I ever. When we passed over the Pacific, we left Midway Island back in the fall of '52, and when we just got out of port, they had served us French onion soup. Well, we got out there another hour or so, and we ran into that typhoon. We rode the typhoon for 3 or 4 days, and every day I was so seasick, I thought I was going to die, and I thought it would be easier to jump overboard than it would to be sick. So, no, I had my times of being seasick, but of course, if you could get a breath of fresh air, you had a half of a chance.
What was the chow like on board the ship?
Well, it was all like dried food and dried milk and dried, beef and that kind of stuff. So there was no such thing as fresh vegetables or fresh milk or anything. So we did have a little bakery, and they would make some loaves of fresh bread at night and that. So
When you had free time on board the ship, what did you do?
Free time on a ship? I didn't know there was free time. No, when I was on the ship, I studied for my 3rd degree in sonar. So I studied for sonar, so by the time I had been in 15 months, I had made SOG-3, so I was 3rd class when I was 21 years old.
So what exactly were your duties? You were a sonar sonar tech. And what exactly did they do, and anything that you remember about that specifically?
Well, what we did, we had to listen to the sonar, which was under the ship, to see if we were running into some foreign submarines or depth charges or hedgehogs. So if we ever were out to sea and we thought we were into a foreign submarine or anything of the kind underwater, we would drop our hedgehogs and depth charges, thinking that we were really at war,
What's a hedgehog?
A hedgehog is something that's got a funny thing on the end when you drop it in the water, and when it hits metal, it takes off.
Did you ever have to, did your ship, it was the Lewis Hancock? Lewis Hancock, did it ever have to drop any depth charges or hedgehogs when you were on it?
Well, we did, yeah. When we were out in the Japanese Sea, we thought we were trailing a Russian sub one night, and we had trailed it for 2 or 3 hours, and of course we had no proof of anything, but being out in the Japanese Sea and in the middle of the night, so to speak, we dropped some depth charges and hedgehogs, thinking that we were going to win the war,
Did they blow up?
I don't know.
Hit a shark, maybe?
Well, if they didn't hit metal, they weren't going to blow up. They just end up on the bottom of the
Gotcha.
ocean.
So, Dad, let me get this straight. Okay. So, Mr. Grollmus, let me ask you. So, where was your basic training, and what was that like?
My basic training was in Bainbridge, Maryland, in the January of 1952. Of course, all of those basic training were 12 third-week segments, but they would break it down to 4 different segments a year. So the weather was quite chilly and cold and windy and that, but we got through it in the late winter, early spring of 1952.
What did you do for basic training?
Well, we did everything but bake cakes.
Did you get in good physical shape?
Oh yeah, when you're in basic training, you don't carouse, you get your bed rest, and so you eat your regular meals, and so, well, with all the walking and parading and all that, you have to be in good shape when you come out of boot camp.
Sure. What was the chow like there in boot camp?
It wasn't bad, it was typical stuff, Everything had saltpeter, and so the guys wouldn't go crazy.
So after basic training, where did you go?
After basic training, I came home for a couple weeks and then went to Boston, Massachusetts, Our home port was in Boston, Massachusetts, which is in Charleston, which is no longer a shipyard, you know, because that's all been moved out to Norfolk or San Diego and out to, they don't have a shipyard in Charleston anymore.
And how long were you in Boston then before you shipped out?
Well, I went into Boston probably in April of '52. We spent 6 weeks in the summer of '52 on a shakedown cruise in Guantanamo, Cuba. So when we came back from Guantanamo, Cuba, in September we left to go on our round world trip on the destroyer.
So you're an 18, 19-year-old young man. What was Boston like back then? And what did you ever have leave to go into the city and see any baseball games or anything like that?
Oh yeah, well I wasn't, when I was in Boston, I was already 21 years old. So we would, when we had Liberty, which probably a Wednesday afternoon or Sunday afternoon, we would go downtown, and through the U.S.S we could get a ticket to go see the Boston Red Sox play baseball for a quarter. So we get on our subway and we go down to the ballpark and watch a Major League Baseball game with for a quarter. That was Dominic DiMaggio and Bobby Doerr and the great splinter Ted Williams, and Joe DiMaggio and his crew would come into town.
Wow.
So we saw lots of wonderful games in Boston. Of course, those were all basically afternoon games in those days.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I watched the ball games there, and I went to the old Boston Gardens and watched the Boston Celtics when they had Bob Cousy and Bill Sherman and all those guys.
Wow.
Even watched the baseball game in Boston on the old Boston Braves,
Wow.
which
Yeah.
will take you back a ways.
Yeah.
Remember the Boston Braves?
Heard of them. So you have fond memories of Boston.
Well, Boston was a great city. I love Boston. I wish I would have had the opportunity to spend more time at Provincetown and Cape Cod and all of those places. But in later years, after I retired, I got back to Cape Cod a couple times and Provincetown once, and spent some awful nice vacations in Cape Cod and on the east coast of Boston. But, and
Now, was that, where did you have your first pizza pie? Was that in Boston as a young man?
the first pizza pie that I ever saw and heard of in my life was in Newport, Rhode Island in 1952. I thought, this has got to be crazy. But that was, see, pizza pies at that time were not even known in the Middle West. They were just a New England kind of thing, you know, Italian. And of course, the Irish never ate pizza pies. They were too Italian for the Irish.
So, Dad, I didn't know you were in Guantanamo. You actually were stationed in Guantanamo Bay for several weeks that summer?
Yeah, on our ship.
Oh.
We were on our ship for 6 weeks, and we would go on an afternoon off, and we'd play softball many times on Guantanamo Bay on a ball diamond. They're off the ship and that. So.
Did you make it into Cuba at all? Besides that?
No, not in. We didn't have much time to go into Cuba. I went into Port-au-Prince, Haiti, on a boat, but a boat is smaller than a ship, you know. So went to Port-au-Prince, Haiti, but never got to Havana. But I've always liked Cuba. I'm glad that we're finally seeing the lights.
Yeah. All right, Dad. So so you shipped out September of '52 aboard the U.S.S. Hancock.
Yes.
So what was that like? That was you were from a small town in Ohio, and suddenly you were not in sight of land for days. Was that a big adjustment? Was there anything else about that?
It wasn't too bad. Of course, when you leave Boston to go on a trip like we did, you had to be careful not to run into the rough waters at Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. So you would go around those because, of course, when we got down to the Panama, that was quite an experience to go through the Panama, which is an interesting story in itself. So, you know, other than particularly rough water, you know, we never, you know, it wasn't that bad of a deal, you know. You weren't getting horsewhipped or anything.
So you went from Boston, then through the Panama Canal, and then Panama Canal to where?
We went around the Horn and landed in San Diego, California in '52. And we were there for a short time, maybe 2 or 3 days. Of course, you have to get their food and fuel up and that. So then we left for Hawaii. So we landed in Hawaii and we were there 2 or 3 days in Honolulu. Then we left Honolulu and went to the Midway Islands where they refueled, and that's where we saw the Goonie birds.
Well, what are Goonie birds?
Goonie birds, it's sort of like a pelican. When it takes off, it's like a what is it, 747 Zeb. And then when they land on their feet, but they tumble over forwards and backwards. That's the reason they call them Goonie birds.
So what was Midway? Did you get to walk around Midway Island? Did you see what it was like?
We were there probably a short period of time, and I didn't get off the ship. We were just getting our supplies to go to Japan.
So then you went to, did you land in Japan?
Our ship went to Japan in Yokohama in the fall of 1952. It was actually, well, probably in October now. We ran into Japan, and of course they had big ground swells then, and the water was so rough it splashed over top of the captain's deck, which was the highest part of the deck. And we were within eyesight of the land, you know. But that's what ground swells are, you know.
Did you go on land in Japan? Have any leave there or liberty?
Oh, I had liberty in Yokohama and Yokosuka frequently. And then I went to Tokyo and I bought my set of Narutaki china. I bought a full set of Narutaki china in Tokyo for $30 and had it shipped back to the States for $40. So I had a whole set of Narutaki china for $70.
Wow. What'd you do with that china later on?
Well, I don't know. See, originally I was in a position where I was supposed to be getting married, and so I kept it at my mom's house. So when I got married in '57, my wife got it. Of course, she's been gone for 25 years, so I don't know who has it now, whether Mary Ann has it or Mary Beth has it, but it's in the family someplace.
So what was Japan like back then when you'd walk around? Were they nice?
Well, you had to be very careful. See, we were there since a short period after the conclusion of the Second World War. So we were always advised when we got liberty, and of course it'd be nightfall, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, and it says don't ever walk down these streets by yourself, because there's some of these people that are very angry at the United States military. They'll take you behind those tents there, and they'll make mincemeat out of you, you know. So you had to be very careful not to walk down the streets in Yokohama and Yokosuka and the seaports, you know. So yeah.
Were the people nice to you though? The Japanese? Any run-ins with them or anything?
Oh no, they were civilized. They were glad to see us for the most part, because they seemed to like our money. But see, we could get 675 yens for $1 American. So you can see, you could buy anything you wanted for a decent investment.
What was Japanese? Was that your first time eating Asian and Japanese food?
Yes, I guess so. I don't know, unless I had egg fouillon and fritters or something.
So, Dad, okay, after Japan, you left, and then did you go over to the waters around Korea?
We went to the waters around Korea. We went to Subic Bay in the Philippines. We went to Malaysia. We went to Myanmar, which used to be Rangoon, Burma back in those days. We went to India. We went to Bombay, India. We went to Hong Kong, which wasn't China at that time, but we did go to Hong Kong. And of course we came around the equator, and we ended up going through the Subic Bay. We stopped and got off the ship in Saudi Arabia, and we played softball out in the oil wells in Saudi Arabia. And so after that we came back to France, and we stopped at Nice or Nice, France, but it's on the French Riviera. Then that was our last stopping point till we came back to Boston.
Wow.
And
So how long were you around in the Korean waters, would you say?
well, of course, our time in the Korean waters or Japan was all the way from late October until probably late February. So we were actually not next to Korea for that many weeks, but we had our little trips, because every day we pulled out of port in Yokohama or Yokosuka, you could see the top of the Mount Fujiyama, which is the mountain that Raphael climbed.
So every day you'd pull out of port, and what would be your duties then? You'd go
Well, we would go
patrol those waters, or
patrol waters and do exercises, After all, there were 8 destroyers in our squadron,
what squadron was that, by the way?
I don't know.
Okay, okay.
I don't know.
Did you ever land in Korea there, or bring supplies or anything?
No. We fired some cannons at, but I think all we got is some seagulls.
You fired some cannons onto North Korea, or
Yeah.
the troops? Why'd you do that?
Well, because that's the war. The South Korea was against North Korea. That was what the war was all about.
Was that scary? Or did you think you might die, or what was that like?
Well, I thought I was going to die when I left San Diego. But that's the way she goes.
And your ship was fired on, wasn't it, by the North Koreans from a distance?
Yeah, it was fired on at a distance, but they didn't get any blood or any paint off the hull, so.
Now, so most of the time you were on the manning the sonar stations.
Yeah.
Okay, I got you.
And sometimes I worked in radar, but of course sonar happened to be a division of the radar in that too. That was all electronic equipment.
Do you see any Korean prisoners of war, or any Russian planes or submarines, or did you see the enemy close up at all?
No, we knew that they were over there, but we didn't see them. No, we were not on land. We were not hand-to-hand combat or anything.
Okay. Well, what are some other things? How about, were there opportunities to attend church services on the ship, or in your time in the service?
Yeah, they had church services on the ship. They would have different denominations and that, but they would, on Sunday, somebody was available to be, able to give the service.
So you made it back to Boston, and then you were discharged?
Well, I came back to Boston in the spring, and the ship that I was on was going to go over to the Mediterranean. And they said, well, you can go to the Mediterranean on this other ship, or on our ship, but I would have to extend for 15 months. I said, no thanks, I don't want to extend for 15 months. So in the meantime, they said, well, we'll send you to sonar school in Key West, Florida. And I said, I'm ready to go. Well, you'll have to extend for 15 months to go to a 6-month school. I said, it's not worth it, so I didn't go to Key West either.
So then you got out of the active...
Well, I was on another ship, and I was discharged from a at Boston Station in Boston in November the 22nd, 1953. So I never really spent a calendar year in the Navy, but I traveled the world and was in 22 countries by the time I was 22 years old.
It sounds like a great experience. Did you meet any friends or anyone you kept in touch with through the years?
No, I had some close friends on the ship, but after that we all scattered. It's just, just everybody went. I had one friend from Louisiana and one from Arkansas and one from Cleveland, and but they all scattered.
And you served side by side with black people, didn't you?
Oh, yes. Yeah, we had a couple in our own division, and they were very, very kind and very considerate, because they were outnumbered, but it was never a problem,
And how were your officers? Were they gentle? Do you anything about them?
Well, they were all great. I had an officer, which was one of my best friends on the ship. He was a lieutenant commander, but he was the only one on the ship that was a graduate from the Naval Academy. But he was absolutely super. He was precision. He was just a gentleman. He just always looked like he came out of the original bandbox,
So, Mr. Grollmus, after serving the Navy, then what happened? You went back to 7 Mile.
Went back to 7 Mile. Worked at Bendix Aviation Company for a couple months. I signed up to go to college at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, the best college town in the United States of America. And so I went to Miami and played baseball there. I tried out for the reserve basketball team. I was asked to be on the varsity track team, the cross-country team, but I told Mr. Ryder I'm too old for that. So I graduated from Miami in 3.5 years in 1957, and
what was your degree in?
My degree was in, I had a major in education, physical education. I had a minor in biology, and I had a minor in industrial arts.
Neat. Where did you live during that time?
Well, my first semester I lived with my mom, and I wasn't doing so well in school, so I lived in the mayor's house my sophomore year. I lived in another lady who was a teacher, a principal in Hamilton. I lived in her house. These are all second-story apartments. Lived in her house for 1 year. And my final year, I lived with Donnie Noto and Connie Inman in Ernie Meyer's house up on North Beach Street. So, but I never lived on campus.
Did you get a scholarship, or was it the GI Bill, or what?
Well, I went on the GI Bill, but after my freshman year, I beat out 2 other guys that were there on scholarships to be catchers for the Miami baseball team. So I had won the first string thing, so Woody Wells, the head coach of the varsity, he said, I'll give you a scholarship on room and board. Well, I said, I don't want to live on campus. I won't take the room, but I'll take the board. So I had to serve as a custodian for these young kids at Miami. They were 18, 19-year-old kids. And so I had my food paid for with my board, but it took up so much of my time, and these young lads, they were from wealthy families, and I was poor, and they dropped their forks and, hey boy, pick up my fork, and hey boy, get me water. So I quit my board, so I went back to my own life. So I quit the scholarship
And you never went to school on the GI Bill?
went to school in the GI Bill.
Gotcha. And what was it like playing baseball back then? Did you travel around?
Oh yeah, well we traveled. It was all on bus and that. We would go on spring break down to Knoxville and down south for a couple weeks, and we went, of course, we went to Toledo, and we went to Kent State. We went to Ohio University, and I was coaching with another man. I was coaching the freshman baseball team when I was a junior. So when I was a junior, we were coaching the freshman baseball team, and we had a young lad from Portsmouth. His name was Gentry. He was a young black kid, just run like... He was playing center field, so that day we played a double header against Ohio State's junior varsity. And Frank Howard was playing on the junior varsity that time against our freshman team. And of course, after he graduated from Ohio State University, he signed a contract for $100,000, which was a lot of money then, but he hit the ball hard 4 times, never got a base hit off of it.
So were you looked at by the pros at all?
Well, I had 3 opportunities to go to training camp with the Reds, tryouts in Cincinnati and Crosby Field and different places. So when after my sophomore year, I had a young man he'd had a lot of baseball experience, and he was going to sign me to a minor league contract because I was finally hitting pretty good and that. So he goes out here on Bysinger Road, and somehow or another he hit a tree and got killed. So that ended my opportunity to get signed for professional baseball.
Sorry to hear that. Right. All right. So what was you grew up on a farm? Any details? But what was life like? A daily life like on the farm for you?
Well, number one, we had no electricity. We had no running water. Of course, if you have no electricity, you don't have fans, you don't have air conditioning. We didn't even have an ice box. So you had to pump your own water. Everything was very crude and that. You had the animals to feed, you had the cows, the horses, the chickens, the pigs, hogs, and all that. Of course, you had to raise wheat, and you had to raise corn, and all of this and that. So, you had to struggle. When we were very young boys, 8 or 9 years old, we had to get up at 5:15 in the morning to milk cows to get the milk out. So we worked, and of course we never knew what it was to have a vacation or to get off the farm. But it was a long struggle, and of course you don't forget those things either,
No. How about your mom? Did she have to work hard preparing food?
Oh, she was a slave. She had to fix food for threshing rings and all of that, and had no refrigeration. And sometimes with the threshing ring, you have 20 or 30 people,
What's the threshing ring?
Well, that's back when you had to combine your wheat. You combine it and put it in shocks. You remember the old wheat shocks? You'd shock your wheat, and then you'd bring it in after it dried and cured, and you'd run it through a thresher. And my grandfather ran this threshing ring for around, 5, 6 different farms. So you had to be very efficient to move that equipment from one farm to another. But to have that many people and to have the dinnerware and all that, and you make fresh slaw and have fried chicken or whatever, for that many people,
Your mom made all that?
Well, of course, when you have a threshing ring, you have some of the women helping, of course,
Yeah.
But other than that, she canned, and we had our hams and our bacon and our shoulders and stuff. Everything was pretty crude, you know.
Wow.
You had there was no such thing as an icebox.
Would you have ice delivered every day, or what was that like?
We never had ice delivered. We did finally eventually get an ice box, and we could go down to 7 Mile, which was only a mile or so away, and you'd get a chunk of ice, maybe 25, 50-pound box of ice, and put in there. And of course, eventually it would melt, so there was no way of keeping milk and butter and stuff, you know, for more than a few days, you know, without replenishing the ice.
Yeah. Would you drink milk right out of the cow?
Oh no, we never drink milk out of the cow. I never liked warm milk, and the milk was so unsanitary. I wouldn't feed it to my cats. You know.
Where would you go to the bathroom? Do you have an outhouse?
Well, we had a 2-seater, you know, with a crescent moon.
And how often, you told me before, how often would you get to take baths on the farm?
Well, back in those days, we were lucky to get a bath in a number 3 galvanized tub, because Mom had to heat the water, and we had to get in the water, and you soap down, and you towel off, but that tub of water had to last for 3 kids, you know, 3 boys.
What did you say, about once a week?
Well, yeah, once a week. You know, we were on a 7-day schedule, you know.
Was it cold in the winter? What was it like in the house in the winter?
Oh, in the house it was so cold. We did have a pot-belly wood stove, or we actually would burn coal in it. I guess it was an old Franklin stove. Remember Ben Franklin? It was a Franklin stove, and we burned coal in it. Of course, by morning, the fire was out, and we were sleeping upstairs, and of course, it's cold and that. We would walk down the steps, half dressed, and that. Me and my brothers, we'd walk out in the kitchen, which sort of was set off the side of the main house, and we would take the ladle and break the ice in top of the water bucket to get a drink of water. Because it was so cold in the house, the bucket of water would freeze over top.
Wow. So, real quick, what was your mom like? She was a hard worker. What else about her?
Well, she was just a hard worker. She was just a civilized. She was a good mother. She worked hard. She did a lot more than she ever got credit for. She just was a slave, and of course, up until the day that she retired from Collinsville School, you know, she used to feed over 100 kids at school every day when they had school and that. And, you know, that's a chore in itself. And she was up in years, you know, and so.
Her name was Anna Stahlhaber. What were her parents like, your grandparents?
Well, my grandfather, he had been gone for some time, and my grandmother raised those 4 kids, 1 boy and 3 girls, all by herself on that farm, and they kept the farm, and they saved the farm, and you know, to have a mother to have a farm like that and to raise 3 kids and not to lose the farm was another story, you know.
Sure. Where was that farm?
That's our farm was on Eaton Road in Butler County, about 3 miles north of the city of Hamilton.
And what were your Grollmus grandparents like?
Well, they were just, you know, they were, my grandfather, I thought he was absolutely a jewel. I thought he was one of the most perfect people I ever saw. He was a good Christian. He was a hard worker, a nonsense kind of guy. There was no such thing as alcohol or tobacco or cursing or anything, because his first cousin was a minister in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, for many years. But my grandmother, she was nice, but she was old-fashioned, and she knew every ache and pain in the world, and she didn't mind telling me.
Dad, we're almost done. What was that one story? You're a little boy. You saved your younger brother's life.
Well, when I was a very young chap, probably 4 years at the most, because this was in the summer of maybe 36, and we had this cistern and we had a well, and of course normally you take the cistern and well and you cover it with these boards, and that's the chickens and cats don't fall in the well. So it was in the middle of summer, and my younger brother at that time was probably no more than 2 at the best, and he slipped and fell down into this well, but by the grace of God, he grabbed on the side of the wall with his fingers. I reached down to try to help him because he was too heavy for me, and my mom was in the house, and I said, Mom, Shorty fell in the well. She came out, she pulled him up and laid him on the ground, and she fainted.
God bless her. Mr. Grollmus, thank you very much. Any other final thoughts or memories about the war or your life in general or raising kids or anything?
No, I've just been very well blessed. I've had a good life. We had 8 wonderful children, had 20 great-grandchildren, had 20 grandchildren and some great-grandchildren, and I have 2 wonderful son-in-laws.
Well, Mr. Grollmus, we thank you for serving our country, and most of all, we thank you for just being a fine human being and the best father-in-law that anyone could ask for. Thank you very much.